Okay. Okay, hi everyone. My name is Alan Messick. I'm with The Rabbit Show. Of course, I'm a rabbit judge, and today we are talking about a very hot topic that's not only in our country but around the world. And that's the RHD virus. And we're fortunate to be joined with not only an ARBA judge, a past president, a Hall of Fame member, but also a diplomat in the American College of Veterinary Medicine and a certified virologist, and that's Dr. Chris Hayhow. So everyone welcome Dr. Hayhow today to talk about this burning subject, which is, of course, RHD. Thank you, Dr. Hayhow, for joining us today and taking time out of your schedule to chat with everyone and fill everyone in on what's going on in RHD, not only in the world, but also specifically what's happening in our country as of late.
No, I appreciate the opportunity, and I hope I can help people understand where we're at.
I'm sure you will. Just to give a brief history, I believe RHD, or what I used to call it VHD, that's not a new thing in the U.S. And I think the first case was in the early 2000s, and I believe that you were the ARBA president during that time. Is that correct?
That's correct.
During the first case?
That is correct. In 2000 in Iowa, that was our first case.
And I remember...
I can back up, Go ahead.
I just remember as a rabbit breeder, I'm going to just empathize with everyone that's watching. When we hear about VHD or RHD, it's a scary thing because rabbits are a big part of our lives. So when we have an outbreak in the U.S., I remember the panic 20 years ago when it hit, and we didn't have Facebook then, so word didn't spread as fast, and good information didn't get shared as well. So I think that using social media like we're doing today, and having you out there, explaining what's going on and squelching some of the rumors and myths, I think that's going to be really helpful to not only calm people, but also to offer good advice on how we can all get through this. So it's really important to have you here today, and I really appreciate it. So in contrast to when you first dealt with it 20 years ago in this country, hopefully we can use social media to help us to make it all better, of sorts.
Sure.
As an introduction for those that are watching, they may not even know what RHD was. If they're if they're new to ARBA or in rabbit showing, they may not have ever even heard of it. So can you explain what RHDv2 is, what RHD is, what VHD is, and maybe some history behind it for everyone?
Sure, Alan. Well, the virus, based on all the historical data folks have looked at, it's presumed that it started in about 1983 as a mutation from a calicivirus that was in some European rabbits. And at that time, there were some Angora rabbits imported from Europe, went to China, and then in 1984, we had the big outbreak. And at that time, everybody called it, or I say everybody, a lot of people called it rabbit calicivirus disease, viral hemorrhagic disease, rabbit hemorrhagic disease of virus. It's all the same disease, but it's called different things by different people. And all of them are caused by a calicivirus. And if you know much about caliciviruses, they're RNA viruses, and they mutate quite a bit. Right now, there are at least 6 genotypes that they talk about, but 3 main ones that seem to be the most prevalent. And that is the first one we had, which was the one they called rabbit hemorrhagic disease virus. The second mutation led to hemorrhagic disease virus A, or as we now call it, type 1. And then the third mutation that's common is this newest one, which is called rabbit hemorrhagic disease virus B, or we call it the type 2. So the virus has been evolving and mutating since the start. And that first rabbit hemorrhagic disease virus that was identified caused very high mortality and pretty high morbidity, which meant almost all the rabbits exposed would get the disease and would succumb. We compare that to this type 2 that we see now, this rabbit hemorrhagic disease virus type 2, which is the one that's been involved in the most recent outbreaks here in the U.S. that we'll talk about in a little bit. That virus now seems to not only affect old rabbits, but also young rabbits, which the original isolate did not do. this virus, this type 2 virus, doesn't cause as high mortality. And the other thing that's odd about it, it's changed its host range. We're now seeing it affecting the hares. We're seeing it now, we're talking wild rabbits, not Belgian hares. We're talking hares, we're talking cottontail rabbits and jackrabbits. So the virus has been adapting and mutating and changing, and we're just going to have to continually monitor it and realize that this is evolving. What we're seeing this disease do, it's evolving, and the virus is going to continue to evolve. I don't know how fast. If you think back, we're clear back to what, 20, 35 years ago since we first found this virus, or 35 plus years ago since it was first seen, and we're only on now the third, what we call subtype, I call variants of the original virus. So presumably there's going to be more found.
So you brought up a really interesting point, and some audience members may not know this, but our domestic rabbits here that we show and have pedigreed and are recognized 49 breeds actually originated from the wild European rabbit. So that's important to know because in the early 80s, those first cases of this RHD that were found were happening in Europe, and they were affecting domestic rabbits and wild rabbits because in Europe, essentially those are the same things, correct?
That's right. In Europe, they have what they call the European brown hare, which if you ever go there and see it, now I haven't seen them in the wild for a few years. First time I saw them, I thought they were Belgian hares.
Wow.
They were big. I'm talking 15 to 20 pound rabbits just out there like your little cottontails in your yard.
And those
were the rabbits that presumably some of these viruses came from.
Okay. So, just when we thought we have enough virus going on in our world and our lives, we've got this thing going on now in rabbits. But at the same time, I think a lot of us have learned a lot about virus and where they come from over the last month because of the pandemic with coronavirus. Is RHD, did that originate in a lab, or did it happen in nature, and is it zoonotic?
Yeah, the data for the people that do all the genetic analysis and evaluate all these viruses and things, they can conclusively show that it was from a wild, non-pathogenic, so it didn't cause disease, calicivirus that was just out there in the rabbits in Europe at that time. And then it mutated into this virus that now we're seeing causing this high fatality. Similar to what we're talking about for some of the coronaviruses that were dealing with this pandemic for people. Now this virus, these rabbit hemorrhagic disease viruses don't affect people, and people can't get sick or have disease from it. But similar to what we're talking about with the coronaviruses in people, these viruses are constantly mutating and evolving and adapting to what's going on. So it's a moving target, trying to control them and trying to predict where they may go in the future.
So just because this disease isn't affecting humans now or other animals, you're saying that, it's mutating all the time and it's changing. So in the future, we could see something different. But as of right now, it's not something that humans can contract.
And that's correct. Same way with the coronavirus in people is not something that seems to cause much of a problem in animals. Now, they have found it in some big cats, and I know they found it in a cat in Belgium, and, the Bronx Zoo had some animals, and there were some stories about some dogs that the virus got in there and replicated, but the virus may have replicated, but it didn't cause a disease problem.
Okay.
But it's something we're going to have to watch. All these things can change over time.
Right. But and one thing that is definitive now, that this virus was aimed originally at only affecting these European rabbits, consequently domestic rabbits also in the U.S. But with this New Mexico case, which we'll talk about in a little bit, the first cases were actually of wild rabbits dying, correct?
That is correct.
So we'll talk about that a little bit later. But to kind of underscore your point that this virus is mutating and it's different than it was in the past. So the case that we're dealing with in New Mexico is like our historic cases. Now, I always thought that RHD was developed in a lab and it was used in Australia to control the wild rabbit population. Can you squelch that myth or add to that?
Well, the virus was not generated in a lab, and there were some people doing research in Wardang province in Australia years ago, and at that time it escaped.
Okay.
I'm not sure where Wardang province is over there in Australia, but the virus escaped, and then the government decided to let it keep going and help the spread, hoping to help control some of the wild rabbit population. And a similar thing happened in New Zealand. So they did take this wild virus that was used in the lab from these other outbreaks, and then it escaped. Whether it was all intentional or not, history, anecdotally, it looks like it was done purposely, and then the government just said, fine, here we go. It was used in an attempt to control the rabbit population, the wild rabbits.
Because I've spoken to some of the breeders in Australia, and they actually say that they're warned by the government to keep their domestic pet rabbits or show rabbits indoors on certain times when the government apparently is releasing this virus. So do you know anything about that? I mean, it's something that's ongoing in Australia with control of wild rabbits, correct?
That's correct. And they were hoping that it was going to help wipe them out. But, just like any species, they're going to try to adapt to the virus, and no doubt some of the rabbits survive and have immunity, and so it's not as successful. So they're continuing to try to control them, but it's a game. How do you balance turning a disease agent loose and then try to protect the population that you don't want to harm? And that's a tough one. But
that's really tough. I can't imagine.
I let those governments handle those things.
Of course. I just can't imagine being a rabbit breeder and trying to make progress and having years of hard work only to have the government a virus that could ultimately, wipe you out. That's a scary thing. And that's not what's happening here in the U.S., correct?
That is correct.
So some countries like Australia, they've been plagued with this for a while, and you mentioned Europe as an early on. What countries currently in the world deal with RHD on a regular basis?
Well, that's a good question. Recently, the stuff I've read, there's over 40 countries that deal with it, and they consider it endemic. It's just there, and how do you live with it, which is most of the European Union. You're talking Canada seems to hit and miss. China still has it. Cuba. Us here in the U.S., we're trending toward it being endemic when you start realizing we have 9 states now, that maybe even 10 that say they're positive or have had a confirmed case in the past. So it's wide, and different groups handle it different ways. Some countries are allowing vaccine. Here in the U.S., if it's in domesticated rabbits, they're still trying to use the stamp out or, depopulate method. But as we'll talk later with what's going on in the Southwest and what they dealt with up in the state of Washington and even in Canada and Vancouver Island, when it's in wild animals, it's virtually impossible to go in and eradicate it, because it's there. You can't catch every animal.
Exactly. We're going to dive into the virus next, but for everyone watching, we're going to do a question and answer period towards the end. I imagine that this topic is going to be really popular. It was yesterday when we posted the flyer, so bear with us. We'll do a question and answer in the end. And also, I imagine, too, that we'll probably do follow-ups on this as it develops with Dr. Hayhow over the next few weeks and maybe months, but hopefully not months. Hopefully it just kind of goes away. But at any rate, we will be doing follow-up with everyone on The Rabbit Show with Dr. Hayhow. All right, so back to the virus. What are signs of RHD in rabbits? Say, for example, you're living in the Southwest, you're really concerned about this. What should you be looking for symptoms?
It's just like some of the other diseases that we commonly see, just like toxemia in rabbits. The first thing you may see is a dead rabbit. Unfortunately, within 4 hours of a rabbit being infected, the virus is already wrapped in their liver and spleen, so they can die pretty quickly. If not, and especially with this new type 2, this rabbit hemorrhagic disease virus type 2 that's been popping up here in several places, with that one, what we're seeing is maybe the rabbits have a decreased appetite, lethargic, they're having trouble breathing. They may have bluish mucous membranes, around their mouth and their eyes because they're having trouble getting oxygen. Some of them near death may have what we call opisthotonus, where they'll have contractions in their neck and their heads thrown back. Some of them will have a foamy discharge or blood coming out their nose. So it's a big range of clinical signs, and physically it just looks like, at least for this type 2, some of the rabbits, they're either dead or the other is they just aren't feeling well, and you know something's wrong.
Right, and those clinical signs, though, you mentioned some of those clinical signs that are pretty average in a rabbitry that we see when just rabbits aren't feeling well, like lethargy and kind of kicking their head back and not eating. So to definitively say that there's one symptom, there really isn't one, is there? That you can say like, oh, my rabbit has this, and so without testing, you can't just definitively, diagnose it. Correct?
That is correct, which is probably a good thing, because severe, overwhelming infections, we say there's pathognomonic signs or something that when you see it, you know it has it. There isn't with this disease. It just causes a syndrome of where the animals just aren't doing well, versus some of them may be dead. But the original rabbit hemorrhagic disease virus that they saw, it was fatal 70+% of the rabbits. Now they say some of the cases to 20%.
You're kidding.
So
wow.
range.
I didn't realize that. I thought it was always fatal.
No,
and actually, that was my next
range.
question. Is it always fatal? So you're saying that not at all. In fact, maybe even as much as 20% is only fatal. So and you were kind of fringing on symptoms and everything. When a rabbit is exposed to RHD, how long do they have before they show symptoms of it?
Well, most of the time, they say within 24 to 48 hours, but they can take up to 9 days. And they usually, in a day or 3 days of when they show clinical signs, it's fatal. Now, I say that, let's face it, it's just like different people. If you get something, rabbits the same way. If you have a high health herd of rabbits that are well maintained, good ventilation, good sanitation, probably it may not be fatal as quickly as somebody that has poor ventilation and maybe they have enteritis problems with coccidia or something, or they have pastorella issues going on. So it's a holistic thing. How good a shape are those animals? Just like now with the coronavirus in people, let's face it, most average people, if they get it, probably are going to be okay. But if you have pre-existing conditions, whether that's heart problems or a transplant recipient or diabetes and things, and you're elderly and you have a weaker immune system, then it may cause more problems. I'm not saying they're the same by any means, but the appreciation is, if your animals are healthier when they're exposed, at least with this type 2 virus, presumably they might have a better chance to make it. They may not, but that tends to be what the statistics say.
Well, that's a wonderful point. We always say that if you take care of your animals and have a good management practice, they are going to be stronger against the average things that go through your barn. So keeping a maintained, managed, clean barn, and with ventilation, that's all going to help keep these rabbits safe. And also, what you said is a really good point, that these rabbits that are not held existing conditions, like in humans with coronavirus, as we keep hearing, if you're not elderly or don't have pre-existing conditions, you're probably not going to suffer from coronavirus. You'll just have it, and your body will build antibodies to overcome it and then fight it in the future. Is that similar to what's going on here with RHD?
Well, we hope so. Let's face it, these are rabbits, and we don't know all the details, and this virus is this Calicivirus virus we're talking about in rabbits. It's mutating and evolving so quickly. Our hope that if it would get into a rabbitry, we would not have high mortality like we were seeing with the initial rabbit hemorrhagic disease viruses, and only time will tell. I mean, the nice thing would be is if it keeps evolving like it looks like it's doing, it may very well be that in the future it's a lot milder disease syndrome in rabbits. But that's me speculating, and I probably shouldn't do that.
Well, it's a positive speculation at best. And let's talk about how it's spread. I mean, how do you, if, for example, right now we're not going to rabbit shows, and I know that when we talk about RHD in Europe, we've been to shows in England, and they say, well, the fastest way to spread RHD is by going to shows. You're exposing other rabbits, you're meeting other rabbitries. Well, we couldn't be in a more stagnant environment right now with people staying home. I mean, we are all not going to rabbit shows, yet this RHD is occurring in our Southwest. So how is RHD spread? And we can't point our fingers to rabbit shows and cars at the moment. So, fill us in.
Well, as far as how is it spread, let's face it, you got to have the virus. It's just like people that are worried about getting coronavirus and you don't leave your house. If you don't leave your house, chances of you getting exposed to this COVID-19 coronavirus are virtually non-existent. Same way with this virus. If you have a biosecure, good rabbitry, none of us are going to shows, chances are you're not going to get it. Now, let's say it was in my rabbitry right now. What's the best way to spread it? Rabbit to rabbit through its any discharge, whether that's through its urine, its feces, through a discharge from its nose, through its eyes. The virus can get on their body. People can touch the virus itself and take it to another rabbit. It can get on the food, bedding, insects, birds. If you don't dispose, I tell everybody, anytime you have animals that die, dispose of them immediately. Don't leave them lay around, because some other animal could come in and eat that, whether it's a hawk or whatever, and spread the virus around. So those are type things that we don't think about all the time, that our virus can be spread, let alone with this one. It could be an airborne virus. This Khaleesi virus we're talking about, we don't know how far the droplets may spread, but it could be an airborne virus. More than likely, it's going to be spread by secretions, whether that's the urine, the feces, or discharge. But all those different ways, it could spread. So for right now, the most likely, if it's going to spread from rabbitry to rabbitry, it's going to be people going site to site. Now, that's different than what at least I think is going on in the Southwest, but under normal conditions, people are the most likely way to transmit the virus from one to the other, from one rabbitry to another.
It makes a lot of sense. But what about flies and other vector like rats and mice? Can they transport and carry the virus as well?
Absolutely. The virus presumably does not replicate. It doesn't multiply in their bodies, but that doesn't mean they can't get it on their feet or on their mouth when they're eating, or they might eat part of an animal that had it and then pass the virus through in their droppings and stuff also. So any of those flies could get on the rabbit that had it and eat some of the secretions from the nose or the eyes or whatever and transmit it. So all those are distinct possibilities, and that's further reason for people, especially while we're down and we can't go to rabbit shows, to clean their rabbitry.
Yeah, exactly.
Get rid of all the trash and bedding that mice and rats and critters like that like.
Absolutely. Great advice. Now, 2 years ago, the British Columbia had a really scary, happening of RHD in the Vancouver area and also on Vancouver Island. It was this time of year. Is RHD more prevalent at certain times of year than others, like right now, for example? Because it really was 2 years ago that we were all dealing with it on the West Coast. We had West Coast classes going on, and we were having to tell breeders from British Columbia and parts of Washington that they couldn't attend. And that was right now. So is April, May, is that a common time of year for RHD to take off?
Well, that's a good question, Alan. Let's face it, the most common way to transmit virtually any infectious agent is when animals or people are in close contact. This is the time of year when rabbits are breeding. They're going to be in closer contact. The numbers are increasing. So it makes more sense that we would see it now, especially before animals disperse after they've raised their young, and when the temperatures start increasing. And when temperatures start increasing, it tends to be, good old UV light, sunlight from the sun, and high temps will tend to, at least if it's a naked virus, if it's just out there without much debris around it, a dead animal, it's not going to live very long in warmer weather and the same in moist conditions. So it's going to thrive for quite a while in dry conditions or protected. But this is an observation that they've made in lots of areas when they had this rabbit hemorrhagic disease outbreak, that it was more common earlier in the year than later. So when you get to late spring, early summer, the level tends to, it will go away completely, but you should see less.
Well, and you can't talk about a drier region of our country than the Southwest. And right now where it's quite cold in if you've been to Southwest New Mexico through Deming, I mean, that's a place that, while it's really south, it has a high elevation, so it's dry and cold. And when we hear about coronavirus, doctors on the news keep saying dry and cold are a good environment for these viruses to take off. So it makes sense that in that maybe region of the country, it's prospering. But with maybe warmer temperatures coming up, New Mexico in the summer is a really hot region. You're saying that you'll see it squelch because of the UV rays, correct?
That's correct. The sunlight.
So if we had...
Sunlight's one of the best disinfectants there is out there.
Absolutely. And we'll talk about more disinfecting and how breeders can at home prevent this, or at least try to safeguard their rabbits. If we had rabbits that we thought might be positive, where do we get them tested? I know that some of the rabbits in Arizona were sent to Plum Island in New York, and they were definitively tested. But is testing for RHD in rabbits something that can be done anywhere, or is it by a special sort of lab that's versed in this virus?
That's a good question. In the United States right now, even though we've dealt with several outbreaks recently, rabbit hemorrhagic disease virus is still considered a foreign disease. And being a foreign disease, there's only one lab in the United States that can do the confirmatory testing, and that's the Foreign Animal Disease Diagnostic Lab in Plum Island, which, if you don't know where Plum Island is, it's the coast of New York. And they're the ones that can do the definitive testing. So if somebody thinks they have the disease, then those samples will be shipped to Plum Island. They'll do the tests in their biosafety level 3 and 4 facilities and then report back the result. So they try to, that way we don't have stuff, anybody around the country sending it to their state lab and testing it and the virus being slopped all over, because those things can happen. I mean,
right.
That's realistic. You just don't want to chance it. So
that keeps things very consistent. And
that's right. And it also will decrease the chance of a positive or a false negative. Let's face it, if you're positive, you want to know it. And if you're negative, you want to know it. And that doesn't mean other people, there aren't good labs around the country, but at least that one lab is the control for all testing.
So
they're the experienced folks.
And who sends the rabbits, the dead rabbits, to Plum Island? Is that something that the average breeder can do, or does that have to be done by the USDA or by the state vet? Who is the liaison?
Well, the system throughout the United States is, we used to have what we called area veterinarians in charge, and there might be several in a state, and those people then would be designated to go out and deal with an emergency. Now what we have is there's a state veterinarian in each state, and he would work with the USA veterinarian in that area. Then they would go out and get samples, and then they would ship them overnight then to the Foreign Animal Disease Lab at Plum Island.
Okay, so it's not...
I mean, some of the state labs may not get involved,
but
at least there's a network of people that are responsible. So they do it right. So you don't cut things open and slop the virus or whatever all over the place. So it's controlled.
Exactly. So the burning subject, right now is the New Mexico and Arizona cases. Do you want to catch us all up to date on what's going on down there? Because I think that you've been in contact with some, officials working on this. And so maybe if you can inform everyone what's going on with RHD in our own country right now in the Southwest.
Yeah, right now, to my knowledge, there are 3 active states. We have the ongoing issue up in Washington, the state of Washington, where they had the outbreak earlier. And now we have this outbreaks in New Mexico and in Arizona. Now, what's strange about, or very different about these outbreaks in Arizona and New Mexico is, they were both of those outbreaks involved this rabbit hemorrhagic disease virus 2. However, to my knowledge, and I've not found anybody that says otherwise, these are the first 2 outbreaks in these states where they confirmed the virus in cottontail rabbits and jackrabbits. There was another outbreak that had been found in hares, but this is the first one where they found it in not only pet rabbits, but also jackrabbits and cottontails. And in those areas, whether it's just due to the population density, the game and fish group and the wildlife group are kind of the conduits for the state animal health authorities there and the state veterinarian. So that's how they've been dealing with it. And for me, this is very interesting because it shows that the virus is indeed mutating or evolving. And anecdotal reports seem to indicate that the fatality rate isn't as high, but it may be early to make that assumption. But the other thing they have noticed is it's affecting rabbits of all ages. So it's not just the old virus we used to see that only got rabbits that were, 12 weeks of age and older, and the fatality rate was high. This one, seems like so far the fatality rate is lower, but it's affecting rabbits of all ages as well as the wild rabbits, the cottontails and the jackrabbits. So I think this is a very interesting situation. I don't know where it's headed, but if that's the case, let's face it, it may be, I hate to say it, in several more states close by here pretty soon. In fact, I was talking to my friends at the Texas Diagnostic Lab today of what they knew about it, and they indicated, there at least a couple of the folks, they weren't even aware that it was already in some of the states in the Southeast. So
wow.
This is happening pretty quick, and it's changing real time. So it's something all of us need to monitor and just be cautious and gather information.
And when you think about rabbit populations in terms of the ARBA and where we have shows, New Mexico and Arizona, they're beautiful states, but let's face it, they're not big ARBA territories. So why the heck did we show up in New Mexico of all places? And for instance, on the Navajo reservations as of lately in northeast Arizona, these are not big city, big dwelling ARBA populations. So can you maybe shed some light on that? Why is it happening in a desolate area like that?
Well, I'll speculate. I can think of 3 ways it could possibly happen, and I'll put them in order of probability, if I can say that.
Yeah.
And number 1 would be somebody bringing in a rabbit from another area that had it, i.e. up in Washington. I don't think that's very likely, but it's a possibility. And then the rabbit getting loose or the virus spreading. That's one way. Number 2 would be somebody handling a rabbit from another area, whether that be in the Washington area, and I'm not picking on Washington, but we know there's an outbreak there now, or did some rabbit get imported that had it and spread it? But number 3, and the one I think is most likely, is these caliciviruses are just out there, and it happened to mutate, and the mutation that we're seeing is very similar to what we see all over the world right now, and the virus is trying to maximize its ability to survive and infect more rabbits, and that's why you're seeing these viruses that seem to show up in clones, that they all seem to be right now rabbit hemorrhagic disease virus type 2. So for me, I think it's just a matter of the virus mutating. I don't think the other possibilities are why, especially when you're in an area that's so the population is so low of people and domestic rabbits, but you've got a lot of wild rabbits out there that are coming in contact with each other, and if 1 or 2 of them have this mutation, then boom, it can spread very quickly.
Well,
That'd be my theory, but I'm just speculating. I don't have any evidence for that yet.
well, if you talk to anyone that's been to that part of the country right now, for example, if you drive from Deming to Hatch, there are wild rabbits running all over the place, and it's also springtime, so there are bunnies and everywhere, and so wild rabbits are populous. While there may not be a lot of ARBA members, there certainly are a lot of wild rabbits. And two, that area is a hay growing part of the country, so the hay that's grown is that a form of a vehicle as well for spreading the virus?
Well, it sure could be. Let's face it, the rabbits are probably there and thriving because A, it's a good food source for them. B, very many predators in that area, so it's their home. And C, if indeed they get the virus, then they could contaminate some of the hay sources and stuff. But that'd be awful tough to test. The only thing you would hope is if people are seeing a lot of fatalities in rabbits, whether it's jackrabbits, cottontails, or even domestic rabbits, near where hay is grown, that they won't use that hay for a feed source to be fed as a forage by itself, or even to commercially make feed. Now, that'd be the recommendation. But I think what you're observing, Alan, makes sense. The hay's there, the rabbits don't have a lot of predators right there, and there's not a lot of population of people, so it's their home.
Absolutely. Now, you talked about the UV rays being a great way to kill the virus. You would think that if hay was transporting the virus, once it got to the feed mill where it's heated to extreme temperatures to make the pelleted feed, that wouldn't the virus die in the processing feed from the raw hays that are used as ingredients?
Well, I would say maybe, but probably not, because you're going to have to get some awful high temps to kill some of these viruses.
Really?
And I don't know how high maybe each one of the manufacturing methods may be. The other part that you would assume is there's not going to be much virus if it gets on the hay anyhow. And you're right. By the time you're sun curing it, before you bring it in, unless it's alfalfa, that a lot of it's going to be inactivated anyhow. So hopefully that is not a risk factor, unless people are actually getting the hay out of the field and putting it for the rabbit right away. And even then, that's low, but it's a possibility. You can't deny that.
Right. It seems coincidental that we've got a hay region of the country. They're making feed there that's made with local ingredients, and then you've got this RHD going on. So I just was wondering if it was a viable vehicle for the virus, even though it's heated up. But you're saying this is a tough virus. So even temperatures in a feed mill may not even be enough to kill the virus once it goes through the pelleting process.
That's right.
And what government agencies are actually charged with an outbreak like this in the Southwest? So if you were living down there, for example, and you maybe had a question about the case, or speculating whether you may have the case or the virus yourself, what government agency is charged with taking over an outbreak, and who can we contact if we speculate that we may have an issue of our own?
No, that's a good question. Let's face it, the first line of defense in anything like this is going to be your local veterinarian. So if you know a local veterinarian, even if they're not a rabbit expert, they can at least tell you who to contact, which in this area you're talking about, whether it's the state veterinarian, which in these two cases, that would be a great place to contact. You're talking about USDA veterinarian, or both of these states, when we're talking Arizona and New Mexico, have a Board of Animal Health, Department of Agriculture, and especially in New Mexico, they'll use their game and wildlife folks for some of the assistance. So you may, especially since this was in wild rabbits, you may have the conservation folks or biologists out there noticing this, so that then they can work with the appropriate USDA folks or the state veterinarian. So everything's coordinated. But in virtually every state in the United States, the state veterinarian is the gatekeeper for that state, so they can have all this information and disseminate it to everybody and post it on their website. So that's
Okay.
where we usually start.
So start with your local vet. If you speculate, you may have an issue. And with these new territories, I mean, it's likely that the state vets in New Mexico and Arizona have never dealt with RHD before. So is RHD on the USDA's radar at all times, or it's something that there is an agency or an office in Washington that monitors these cases and kind of collects data to work on it and to come up with a solution? I mean, like, where does the USDA fall into it in terms of education and control?
Well, it's all under U.S. of Agriculture, under the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service.
So
Okay?
APHIS.
And they have a group called Emergency Programs. Their an acronym is EMOC. And they're the ones that monitor all these foreign animal disease or these disease outbreaks so they can disseminate information. To give you a good idea, when this first outbreak in the U.S. happened in 2000 in Iowa, I was on the phone sometimes 2 and 3 times a day with conference calls with the folks from emergency programs. They were constantly monitoring the situation. At that time, what in the world the ARBA even was, because they had never dealt with rabbit hemorrhagic disease outbreak, and they were trying to find out who we were and trying to disseminate information to us so we could share it. So there are people out there that monitor it, and the system in place right now for at least these outbreaks is the state veterinarian or the state animal health board or the state Department of Agriculture, however you want to term it. They're the ones that are going to provide the detailed information. And in fact, in Arizona and New Mexico, if you go to their websites, they have information, and they posted one of them as recently as last Saturday for updated information. That's Arizona.
So you just brought up a point that I didn't think about, and that was whether or not the ARBA is on the USDA's radar. And it sounds like, thanks to your early work in 2000, where USDA didn't even know those government officials at Fish and Wildlife, now they do. So do they contact ARBA? Do they contact show rabbit organizations like ours when something like this happens to say, like, hey, this is going on in this region of the country, we need to keep an eye on it, and suggest dissemination of good information amongst our members? Where does the ARBA fall into this relationship on a government level?
I know in the last few outbreaks with President Humphreys and then Executive Director Eric Stewart, they had been in contact with these groups to make sure that the ARBA was getting all the right information, and then they were able to relay that on. So I think right now we have a good relationship with these groups, but we need to make sure we continue to strive to keep that so that we know that those groups in the government that are managing things know what our situation is and what our needs might be, and that they can adapt, or we can help each other if possible.
So to foster that relationship... Go ahead, I'm sorry.
That's right. We need to keep fostering that relationship. And those are good people. They may be, some of them are bureaucrats, and they may want to... a lot of people don't like the fact that they want to eradicate some of these diseases. But if you understand the philosophy on living with a foreign disease or an infectious disease that's highly fatal, if you can get rid of it and eradicate it, that makes so much sense in the long term. So that's why I keep saying that this situation is evolving so quickly, because now we have to throw in that caveat that it's in wild rabbits now. What do you do with that? Exactly. It's there, and if that's going to continue to happen, then the government may have to change their strategy. In the past, what they did, just like the outbreak, I'll just reference the one in Iowa. When that first happened and they found it, they went in there, scraped up the dirt, everything, and disposed of it. Well, you can't do that with wild rabbits. You're never going to catch them all and control them, and I'm not sure all the wildlife folks and some of the hunters and stuff would want you to do that. So it's a different dynamic, and this is something that I don't know what the policy is going to be going forward, but it's going to be an interesting situation to watch how it's handled. we experienced the same thing up in Washington, where they had those rabbits that were supposedly pets that were turned loose. And what do you do with those? You can't go in and kill them all. Or if you're going to try, it's going to be very difficult. It only takes one pair and you're going to be back at square one here pretty soon. So at least up in Washington, what they did was the government, at least the states, worked with the federal government and got authorization to bring in some vaccine to use in that quarantine area. So that may be something that the government, I know, isn't big on doing those type things, but it may be a tool that we're going to have to start thinking about more in our toolbox.
So you just touched on the next subject, and that is a vaccine. And the burning question amongst our viewers is there a vaccine for RHD? And where can we get it? And then I want to ask you, is vaccinating a good idea? You could go through the pros and cons of vaccinating. I think it may come as a surprise to some that vaccinating, as you'll talk about, may not be the end all or the best answer. So if you could get into the vaccine, where it is it around, and how can we get it? And then the pros and cons of it, please.
Yeah. So in the U.S., the USDA Vet Biologics in Ames, Iowa, they're the ones responsible for licensing animal vaccines. I've been involved in hundreds of vaccines that got licensed in the U.S., and it's a very strict process, going clear back from your master seed, which that's how you know you've got a pure agent. You do safety testing, then you do live animal testing in a controlled situation, and then you test it in the field. There is no rabbit hemorrhagic disease virus that's approved and licensed in the United States. However, there are vaccines licensed for rabbit hemorrhagic disease. All three of the common subtypes, there are licensed vaccines in other parts of the world. The U.S. would prefer not to bring any of those in, as you can imagine, because once you bring them in, any animal that's vaccinated, if you do a serology test, a blood test for antibodies, they're going to show up positive. When they had that unique situation out in Washington, they said, okay, we'll let you bring that vaccine in, but only if you're in the quarantine area and your animals are at risk. Now, there is a process in the United States where veterinarians can request exemption to bring in vaccine for use. And that would be the only way right now that the U.S. may allow some vaccine to come in here. But it is under very strict control, and usually you have to justify why you would need it, whether it's just for your own use or in this special situation. And to give you an idea, what we've done in some of our animal species, like right now in if you know what's going on in North Carolina, the last I heard, we're up to 11 flocks that are positive for avian influenza, turkey flocks. Mm-hmm. And even for that, guess what they did? They went in and stamped out and slaughtered and decontaminated the area and stuff to stop the virus. Now, whether that's going to work with some biosecurity, I do not know. In some areas, we have plans now, if there are big outbreaks in poultry facilities, chickens, they're thinking about doing what we call ring vaccination. So if you can imagine, it's kind of like a bullseye would be in the middle, and that's where the original outbreak was. They would completely depopulate that, but there might be a buffer around that of, let's say, 5 miles or 10 miles or some area where they would vaccinate all those birds to protect them. And then they could monitor when they start putting birds back in the middle of the bullseye, did it work? Now, the reason I bring that up, and I'm not an advocate of it, is if we're going to continue to have some of these outbreaks in the wild animals like we're seeing now in Arizona and New Mexico, we may have to come up with some hybrid or unique way to help control it. I don't think it's going to happen overnight, because you're certainly not going to vaccinate wild rabbits by any means, but there may be some dispensation to allow breeders in some of those areas that are susceptible to be able to use some vaccine.
So you said that.
Now, that being said, the vaccines aren't the answer to the world. Go ahead.
Well, I really want to talk about where you're going with this next, but for those that may be vaccine, you're saying it needs to start with a veterinarian who can maybe be granted this variance to use a foreign vaccine. Is that any veterinarian, or does your local vet have to be in contact with a state agent, a veterinarian, say with APHIS or with their local government?
Well, the local veterinarians may be the conduit, but it's all managed by USDA.
Okay. So a breeder,
U.S. Department of Agriculture would be the ones that would approve it.
So the breeder will still start,
if that's possible.
The breeder still starts with their local vet, who then will go up the chain of sequence to whoever has that ability to import those foreign vaccines. But at any rate, start with your local vet, correct?
That's correct, because they're not going to authorize a non-veterinarian to bring in the vaccine. Some veterinarian's going to have to bring it in, and it's not just going to be because I want it. It's going to have to be justified. You got to say because these animals are at risk because the disease is 3 miles down the road or something, if you know what I mean.
And we were talking.
But there is a process in place till you can get permission.
We were talking earlier about you bringing in the vaccine for RHD back in the day, and you've probably brought in more vaccine than any other veterinarian in the United States for RHD. Is that correct?
Not for RHD, for other bugs.
For other things.
But I worked for a company that made an RHD vaccine that was licensed in Europe.
Really? And they're a U.S. company,
yes.
Or they're based in Europe?
They're a U.S. company, but they're based in Europe.
And in Europe.
And they can't bring it's manufactured in Europe. That is correct.
Okay, wow. And is that the vaccine that breeders in the U.S. today, when they do have access to it, is it from that company that you worked for?
Potentially.
Okay.
There's several different vaccines out there. The one thing, when people say vaccines, remember there's vaccines to all three of the types that are out there. So if you get the vaccine to the original rabbit hemorrhagic disease virus, or what we called type A at the beginning, or I call it 1 now, they will not provide immunity to the type 2.
Wow.
Which is the ones that are most common here. The one in Washington, Arizona, and New Mexico. There may be some cross protection, but not enough that's going to make a difference. At least that's what they say now. They don't induce protective antibodies that's going to save the rabbit or from the virus if they get exposed.
Very interesting.
So you got to make sure you've got the right vaccine to begin with.
Of course. So
the people that miss out on some of this is let's say you brought in the vaccine. There's a lot of safety concerns I would have, and I'm not saying that some of the other foreign countries don't have good regulations, but making sure that the vaccine is not contaminated with something else, making sure that it's safe to use. And what I mean by that, is it going to cause a lump where you give it? Is the skin going to come out? Is it going to cause sterile abscesses? We don't know what the cost may be. And we don't know how long term, if it induces immunity, how long that immunity may last. Because most vaccines, if they're what we call a killed vaccine, which they're inactivated with formaldehyde or some agent, all right? Usually you have to give at least 2 doses to induce a good immune response. And even then, it may not last very long. So it's a good question on should we vaccinate or not, and is it safe or is it even worth it? Because some of these products are pretty expensive. I've heard some figures from up in the Northwest, up in the Washington area, of some of the prices, and some of the prices I'm hearing may be as much as the rabbit might be worth in some cases.
Wow.
So
yeah, that's
if that's what the people up there want to do, that's their business.
So you mentioned earlier that vaccinated rabbits will always test positive for RHD. So if you could dive into why vaccinating may not always be the best idea, and you've hit on it a few times, but if you could elaborate more on that, why wouldn't we just vaccinate every rabbit in the country for RHD if we had access to the drug? to be safe? You know, what are the cons to doing something like that? Because I know in England, for example, not every breeder vaccinates, even though the accessibility to the vaccine is a lot more than it is here. Even then, some breeders still choose not to vaccinate, and it's not necessarily a monetary reason. It's they have a logic behind it. So if you could get into that, that'd be really helpful.
Yeah, well, no, that's a super question, because the first thing we always talk about when I used to do vaccine work is everybody wanted a vaccine that would induce what we would call sterilizing immunity. And what sterilizing immunity is, in fact, I can only think of one vaccine off the top of my head that does it, and that's rabies vaccine. If you are properly vaccinated, if you properly vaccinated an animal for rabies, even if they get bit, chances are the virus is not going to replicate. It's not going to grow in you. Mm-hmm. Now, what do they always say? If you have a dog and he gets bit, he's already had rabies vaccine, booster him, which makes to make more antibodies. The concern you have is if you have rabbits right now, you're going to vaccinate them with one of these vaccines from Europe, which let's assume they're fine as could be. That doesn't mean your rabbit still can't get exposed to rabbit hemorrhagic disease virus. The virus replicate in it, and it shed the virus. Or it might have the virus when you vaccinate, and it's shedding the virus. And rabbits can shed the virus, they know, for at least 105 days following infection. So there's no guarantee, there's no perfect vaccine. So you need to go into this, if you're going to think about vaccinating, with your eyes open. The other thing to think about is vaccinate them, presumably they're going to make an antibody response. You know, just like now, people think, oh, we should have a coronavirus vaccine. And they're going to make an antibody response, which then means if the virus comes in, the antibodies will attack it, and you're not going to get sick. The downside is any rabbit you would vaccinate with these vaccines, if it's a very good vaccine, they're always going to be positive. So if somebody goes in to test them, if they use an antibody test, how are they going to know your rabbit was vaccinated versus exposed to the live virus?
Exactly.
You can say it was vaccinated, but that doesn't mean it wasn't exposed to the live virus. So it's not as easy as A, buy the vaccine, B, vaccinate the rabbit, C, it's protected. There are some other issues to think about in there. Let alone will the vaccine even work? Because you can vaccinate your rabbit for type 2, and then what if type 1 comes in? Or what if there's a mutation
or a new
in
mutation
6 months and it's 3 to call the next one?
Exactly.
Yeah, and it's going to mutate. These viruses mutate.
The other thing that's scary is that, and tell me if this is true or not, that just because a rabbit is vaccinated for RHD doesn't mean they can't carry it, correct? So you could have a vaccinated rabbit at a show that'll never get the virus, but still could be transporting the virus to other rabbits.
That's correct.
So that's really scary.
Now they say the stuff I've read shed the virus for at least 105 days that they've done. So who knows how long, but they can shed virus for a long period of time. We know that.
And how long does the vaccine? How long does it take once you vaccinate a rabbit for it to actually be effective against the virus?
Well, for most killed vaccines, you give them a vaccine, they're going to start making antibodies. They'll have some protection at 2 to 3 weeks of age, and that's why usually you come back and booster at 3 to 4 weeks of age, so that then they get what we call an anamnestic response or a memory response that's longer lasting. So really, you're talking realistically a month out before they would be protected. And I say a month from they got a first dose now, a booster in 3 weeks. So about a week after that, they should have as much immunity as they're probably ever going to get. So
vaccinating is not something that you can do today and then say, oh, I'm safe from RHD. I'll never get it because all my rabbits are vaccinated. You have to literally wait out, a 30-day period before you're really able to say, this rabbit's not going to get it now because it's been vaccinated. So it's not an overnight cure or preventative.
That's right.
So
that's assuming that all the rabbits are going to make make a good immune response, respond to the vaccine, and they're all going to be protective and they're all healthy. Same way with people, when we go to get vaccinated, hopefully we all get protected, but we know that's not the case. The magic number we always used to hear, 80 to 85%. We call that herd immunity. So if 80 to 85% of the people are protected, like if you go out and get your influenza vaccine now, you figure if 80 to 85% of the people are protected, then even if the virus comes in, most of us are protected. So we're not going to have virus replicating and we're spreading it all over. So most of the people are in good shape. So it's that herd immunity concept. Everybody is in pretty good shape so that even if the virus would come in, it's not going to be able to take over. And that's the reason this virus, COVID-19, is potentially so devastating, because most of the people don't have immunity to this virus. There must be some out there, because there's lots of coronaviruses in the world, okay? But there should be some level, because we're not seeing it very much in young kids. So you figure some of these young kids have an exposure to another coronavirus that's probably providing some protection. Let alone, hopefully, most of them are pretty healthy. We know they're not all, but so viruses don't all read the book and do it the same way, I guess is what I'm saying. And they're constantly going to mutate. So I surely wouldn't hang my hat on vaccinating rabbits for rabbit hemorrhagic disease virus. That's for sure.
And what can breeders do if they're not going to vaccinate it, say, or the vaccine isn't available? What are some practices that we can do all in our own rabbitries to help safeguard us from RHD, say it's in our area or whether it's not? I mean, just some good general practices. And is bleach a good agent to disinfect with?
That's the best question you've asked tonight from my perspective, is what can each person do? And I think it starts with biosecurity and common sense, because the virus is not going to survive if you use the phenolics, or even 10 to 15% bleach. It's going to inactivate the virus. Now, I say that it's going to inactivate the virus if it's on a reasonably clean surface. So if you've got a dead animal, you want to bury that or get rid of it or incinerate, however you can get rid of them. But if you've got a clean surface and you can put 10 to 15% Clorox bleach on it, or this Environ on there, 1 or 2% Environ, wait 10 to 15 minutes and then rinse it off, because those products are corrosive. That should help sanitize and inactivate the virus. So that's step number one that we can all do, is clean our rabbitry. You hit on it earlier, though, Alan, and that is we're not going to shows. So now should be a good time for people to think about their biosecurity program. If you don't have rabbit hemorrhagic disease virus and you don't go to other people's rabbitries right now or let them come to yours, then you're probably not going to get it. Simple as that. Very few people are going to have rabbits shipped in right now from some area that has, or they're going to have wild rabbits bringing it to them. The biggest thing would be is if you, as a rabbit raiser, are going to go out to an area that has it and bring it home to yourself. So you need to think about things like, is my ventilation good? Have I cleaned the area so there's rats and mice aren't in there? You may want to think about putting in a foot bath before anybody goes in there, or tell people, you cannot come to my rabbitry if you've been around other animals. When I was in pharmaceutical industry, we'd go to some of these big swine operations where they'd have 40, 50,000 breeding sows on one spot. They would tell us we couldn't have been to another farm within a week. You had to take off your clothes, shower in. A couple of them, we went underneath a barrier. You come out on the other side, take another shower, and then put on clothes. So we don't need to be that extreme, but you need to think about, how do you set up a barrier to keep the virus out, to keep your animals healthy and safe? And for some people, it's common sense. Some people will be scared and don't want to deal with it. But common sense says if you don't have it now and you're not letting new rabbits come in and you're not letting other people bring it to you, that your animals should be safe.
That sounds like great advice. And we couldn't think of a better time when we're all sitting at home stir crazy. We can't go to rabbit shows. We can't even go to work to rabbitries and enact some of these great management practices like ventilation, clean trays, clean surfaces. Would you recommend against using wood materials and things made of organic material that have a harder time being disinfected and moving more towards things made of metal? Is that a good practice as well?
Exactly. You want things that are easy to clean. And as you said, just like now when around the country aren't allowed to do much but sit at home and talk on the phone or play on the computer and stuff. If you put in some of these management changes that we're talking about now with ventilation, sanitation, you should decrease, hopefully, your Pasteurella problems. You should decrease maybe your enteritis problems due to coccidia. So there's other benefits too. And anything that you can clean easily, that's what you want. Let's face it, wood products and stuff aren't as easy to clean and disinfect as the metal type products and stuff, or even the plastic. I know a lot of people have these mats now that are, I hate to use the term rubber, but they're polyethylene, the hard stuff.
Yes.
And you can disinfect those and there you go. Versus a piece of wood in the cage, it may not be as easy to clean, and then you may be spreading coccidia or other infectious agents around.
Great advice. And for the breeders that are in New Mexico and Arizona, where there's a population and where it's looking like this new strain is affecting wild rabbits, would you advise breeders to keep wild rabbits off of their property as much as possible if they were in a rather highly infected area?
Well, I think that makes a lot of sense. Practicality, I don't know how it is to manage though, because rabbits are wild rabbits. They're going to go find a place to live and find a place for food. But if you can somehow, whether you put up some barrier fence or thin them out somehow, that should be a great way to help diminish your exposure also. But let's face it, we don't know which wild rabbits might have it. But if you have any, if you can limit that exposure, it should help decrease the chance your rabbits are going to get contaminated.
And you mentioned,
and who knows, at the end of the day, they may come in and start doing this stamp out again. If the government may come in and start eradicating rabbitries because they can't do it to the wild rabbits. So
that's really scary. You mentioned that flies can also be a vehicle for this virus. So would you recommend putting up automatic fly sprayers to keep vector down in the rabbitry to minimize other vehicles of this virus?
Well, I think the first thing would be is sanitation, clean the place, get the water and the breeding spots, the manure out of there as much as you can. Whether you need to spray a little bit, spray low where you're at the bottom, the fumes aren't going up on the rabbits, or even hang a bunch of fly strips and stuff. And I know a lot of people use the predator wasps now and stuff, but anything to decrease pests, whether that's dogs, cats, rats, mice, possums, any critter that might come in there, you're decreasing the chance of spreading another disease or at least this disease around.
And, we've said that we're not rabbit shows right now, so we're probably not buying rabbits and trading rabbits like we normally are. But say, once things loosen up and we go back to rabbit shows, what's a good quarantine procedure for bringing new rabbits into our barns to help keep us safe from RHD?
Well, and that's always tough for people that show animals. You quarantine them. Ideally, you want to think about if you're bringing in any new rabbit, anytime, I would make sure you keep it away from the rest of the herd for at least 30 days. So you can find out, does it got Pasteurella? Does it got coccidia? Whatever. In this case, we're talking, could it have rabbit hemorrhagic virus? So take care of your rest of your animals first and go to that animal last. Change clothes in between groups and don't go back. So common sense type things. And I would quarantine, like I said, for a minimum of 30 days. You under most conditions, if the rabbits have the virus, they're going to show some clinical signs within 9 days or so, is what statistics say. but that doesn't mean they couldn't be asymptomatic and shedding the virus. So you just need to use some common sense.
Or even as you
try
mentioned,
to minimize the risk.
Even if we went to vaccinations and we had, we were buying rabbits that were vaccinated, like you said earlier, even a vaccinated rabbit can still essentially carry the virus. So a quarantine procedure, good one to have in practice, correct?
Correct. And it's tough. I mean, anybody that goes to these big rabbit shows, let's say you go to convention, how many times do people go to convention and come home and have the convention crud for a couple of weeks?
Exactly. We've all been there.
Lose some. It's just the nature of the beast. They're going to get some different ventilation, different water. Their animals next to them have different, whether it's different Pastorella strain or a different E. coli strain or whatever bug. That's a great mixing vessel for us to spread disease around the country. So you just have to use some common sense when you're bringing animals back to your rabbit, or you're bringing in new ones especially.
That's great advice. We've taken up more than an hour of your time, and I know you said you've already been on tons of conference calls today already with your own professional job. But if we could take maybe 5 or 6 questions from our audience right now, and then we'll say goodbye for the night, and hopefully we can reconvene and bring up this as it evolves and as we know more in the future. So if you guys have some questions from our live audience, if you could post those. And I'm going to read one now. Why would they eradicate wild rabbits? Give me one, Dr. Hayhow. I've got to move my phone so I can read the comment. Okay. So why would they eradicate rabbitries when it's in the wildlife? The WSDA vets said specifically there was no reason to depopulate when it's in the wildlife. They wouldn't even extend quarantine dates for areas past to initial dates when it started. Does that make any sense? Or can you make sense of that? Dr. Hayhow?
Yeah, I think the big thing, it's a good question. I think the big thing is, and I'm trying to say this nicely, we have this COVID outbreak right now, and our U.S. government and our president say what they think everybody should do, and different states are doing different things. And I remind folks all the time, all states are sovereign. They can do pretty much what they want to an extent. And I think that's how I would view this situation that happened up in Washington. To my knowledge, that's the first time USDA allowed someone to import a vaccine, and basically they're kind of ring vaccinating around an area to protect it. Now, does that mean that to protect the domestic rabbits in the area? Does that mean that New Mexico and Arizona would do a similar thing? Only time will tell. Or if this is starting to spread through the wild rabbits, then it might be pretty tough to convince people that we're going to do the stamp out method. But I think it's going to be up to each state to make that determination and what they think is best to protect the animals in their area. I would think that if it's not found in the wild rabbits, like it has been down there in New Mexico and Arizona, that most states would continue to do this stamp out method, so we'd have to live with it. But that's something, as I said when we started, this is evolving and changing quickly. So what we say today may be very different in 6 months. So I think we all need to be flexible and open-minded and just be cautious and keep gathering information so we know what's best to do as these outbreaks happen.
Sherry Martin asks...
I hope I answered the question.
I think so. Sherry Martin asks, can you explain more about the foot bath? So maybe she's asking how to create a foot bath in your rabbitry for biosecurity.
Sure. And if you go to a lot of... in other animal industries, and I think swine and poultry are the ones that I know are the most sophisticated, if I can say that. And what they do is they'll get these big metal pans, and they'll put in some disinfectant in there, whether it's Zephyrin, some phenolic that you can use for a foot bath, and most farm and fleet or farm supply places have them. And then what they'll do is you clean your shoes first, or maybe sometimes change your boots. They'll have that liquid in the door, liquid in the pan outside the door. And when you go in there, you stand in it, it gets on your boots or your shoes, and then you can go into the facility. So if you Google foot pads and things, I mean, they're very commonly used in lots of animal species. And like I said, I've been in places around the world where you had to double shower and put on their clothes and everything just because they had pathogen-free animals and they didn't want you to possibly contaminate them. You know, some of them would even make you go in there and blow your nose and clean your fingernails, all these wonderful things. But a foot bath is something that I can tell you what we saw in some of the animal species. If you said you had a biosecurity plan in place and you had to do a foot bath, you didn't want to go there because they were afraid they were going to injure your animals or infect your animals. So that's another deterrent to keep people or remind people that, oh, I was at Fred or Betty's the other day. They've had some sick animals. Maybe I better not go here. But foot baths are really pretty easy. Getting a pan 2 or 3 inches high and putting the liquid in there. And some people even have like a little mat in there that you can change and then get the bottoms and the sides of your feet wet.
That's excellent tips. Thank you very much for that. Joe Kim asks, is mass production of an affordable vaccine in the U.S. a reality? And does the ARBA have the power to lobby for the vaccine's approval?
Well, mass production in the U.S., I would think would be a dream. I don't know anybody in the U.S. that has the facilities. Now, there are foreign companies, like I say, I worked for one that has a licensed rabbit hemorrhagic disease virus vaccine. But you're talking agents that are slow to grow, and it may be an extended period of time to ramp up vaccine production, let alone if that production of vaccine might be needed for their own use, for their own, say it's in Europe, for their animals and stuff. So it's tough. I don't know how much lobbying the ARBA could do, because as I said, right now, to get a vaccine approved in the U.S., and I know the folks in Ames at Vet Biologics, they're not going to approve any vaccine unless they test it themselves. I can assure you of that. Now, would they permit something to be imported? Yes, we have that process right now, but it's not just sign your name and you get it. You have to justify it. There has to be a reason in place, and you're going to have to make sure that you have a veterinarian in the loop that can provide that justification. And then the states may say no. So the ARBA, we could do some lobbying, but I'm not sure how far it would go.
Very good.
It'd be an uphill battle, let me put it to you that way, because we're not a regulatory group.
One more question for you before we let you go. And we've got a lot of breeders, by the way, watching. We've got almost 200 throughout this segment, Dr. Hayhow, and we're getting a lot of thank yous directed towards you. You can't see those from where you're sitting, but the outpouring of thanks and gratitude from ARBA members and rabbit breeders across the world is high. So thank you very much for your time there. If I could read every single one, I would, but I know you've got dinner to go to. But this last question comes from Ethan in Tennessee. If breeders are importing rabbits from foreign countries, what is the proper quarantine period before taking them to an ARBA show?
That's a good question. Knowing that they can shed the virus for 105 days at least, I would say myself, if I brought in something, I would say I'd wait at least 4 months. That'd be 120 days, even after I had it in quarantine. But that's a tough question, because I'm not an advocate of importing animals against people that do it. But I can tell you this, USDA's position is that until we see outbreaks in Arizona and New Mexico, that if the U.S. was going to have rabbit hemorrhagic disease virus, that it was going to be a hobby person in it that would probably be the source. But I understand people are going to import because they want some new genetics, and I'm all in favor of that. just have to be very cautious if you import animals, taking them to the show. But knowing rabbits can shed virus even if vaccinated, and they can shed virus for at least 105 days. I would think no less than 120 days or 4 months, I would think, before you take them out. But that's just me. So
Well, it sounds like
there's no, the ARBA has no rule for that. And Chris has no rule for it. So.
well, I suppose it's always better to be safe than sorry, as we always like to say. So, Dr. Hayhow, thank you very much for your time and for sharing all this wealth of information. You've certainly been working with this virus longer than anyone else, and from your career and your professional standpoint as a veterinarian and virologist, we couldn't ask for a better ARBA member and judge to liaise and help us all come up to date with what RHD is, where it's at now, and what's going on in the Southwest. So thank you very much. We really appreciate everything you've done for us tonight, and we hope that maybe we can have another chat in the future if as more updates come up with the developments in the West.
Yeah, if I could I just like to say one thing is for people, I think the logical thing right now is just to be cautious, continue to gather information, and use common sense when dealing with this, because this is evolving. This situation is evolving. If you'd have told me 6 months ago that jackrabbits and cottontails were going to be dying from this, I'd have told you you're wrong, and here we are. So we just need to continue to gather information and make informed decisions, and hope for the best.
That's great. Thank you very much again, Dr. Hayhow. Have a wonderful evening and enjoy your shelter in place in Ohio.
Yeah, you too.
Chat again soon. Bye-bye.